Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-min. Following the meeting of the century, as it's being called, between the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. in Singapore, attention is now shifting to how the two men will follow through on the pledges outlined in their joint statement. China wasn't officially represented in the summit, but its presence loomed large in the backdrop. On this week's episode, we will take a look at Beijing's diplomatic role in the post-summit landscape. First, let's take a look at a short clip.
On June 12th, the leaders of North Korea and the U.S. met face-to-face for the first time in history, after 65 years of hostilities following the Korean War.
We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. They've been tremendously successful, and it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 풍경과 관행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리우기도 했는데 우린 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump agreed to leave the past behind and move forward. Following historic one-on-one expanded bilateral talks, a working lunch, and a brief stroll around the hotel, the two leaders signed a joint statement.
The letter that we're signing is very comprehensive, and I think both sides are going to be very impressed with the result.
역사적인 이 만남에서 지난 과거를 돕고 새로운 출발을 알리는 그 역사적인 문건에 서명을 하게 됩니다. 세상은 아마 중대한 변화를 보게 될 것입니다.
The document outlined four key commitments: establishing new bilateral relations, building a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, reaffirming the Panmunjom Declaration to work toward complete denuclearization, and recovering the remains of prisoners of war and soldiers who are missing in action from the Korean War. The summit meeting is held as a first step towards denuclearization and the start of new relations between Pyongyang and Washington. But critics say the agreement made little actual progress towards denuclearization, as it fails to include details about CVID and its timeline. In a press conference that followed the summit, President Trump said that the meeting was the beginning of an arduous process, suggesting there is still much work to be done.
Chairman Kim is on his way back to North Korea, and I know for a fact as soon as he arrives, he's going to start a process that's going to make a lot of people very happy and very safe. Chairman Kim has told me that North Korea is already destroying a major missile engine testing site.
Now, the attention is turning to what the next step will be. After a phone conversation with U.S. President Trump on the results of the summit, South Korean President Moon Jae-in convened a national security meeting to discuss Seoul's follow-up measures to the agreement reached between Kim and Trump. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we shed light on how quickly and to what extent North Korea and the U.S. will deliver on the agreements and predict how the regional powers will react to the summit's outcome.
With me in the studio for discussion today is Dr. Kim Chang-su, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. Thank you for joining us today, Doctor.
Many thanks and good to see you again.
Right, so we want to go first with the press conference that was held after the Singapore summit. In the press conference, President Trump repeatedly mentioned China's President Xi Jinping as his friend, and he highlighted the importance of China's role in this landmark summit. So what kind of role did China play in this outcome of the Singapore summit?
I think China has definitely played a very important roles in the past and present, and it'll play an important role in the future as well. Not only comes to the denuclearization of North Korea and the peninsula as a whole, but also how we're going to build a new peace regime on the Korean peninsula. That is very vital and important, and it will be the very important developments. And the Chinese role will be very significant because China has been involved in this part of the world for the last 70 years, including the Korean War, and they have definitely very important roles to play. Now, given the size of the economy and the strong significance and influence over the particular North Korean leadership, I think China will definitely play a very important role, not only confining to this particular meeting in Singapore. They actually played a very important behind the scenes Xi's role, and no question about that. Yeah.
I see. And a lot of reports in the international media is referring to China as a winner of this outcome of the summit. So what's your take on that? And especially, I think this comes after the consideration that President Trump shortly mentioned that he will stop those war games, which are provocative, which is referring to the South Korea-U.S. joint military drills. So do you think this has anything to do with China being a winner?
Oh, yeah, you might call them the winners because depending on how you describe the winners, and if you look at all the process of the Singapore the summit and the immediate future, as a matter of fact, I think the immediate impact is very important because the protocol and the game or the summit itself is all very good, important, but when it comes to how we are going to denuclearize North Korea, and how we are going to establish a new relationship between Washington and Pyongyang will be definitely important. And China, too, can play a very important role. And China has been very successful. China is definitely a loser, of course, but China has been the biggest behind-the-scenes winner in this particular summit. So in that sense, you might call China the biggest winner. China definitely played a very important role. Without the Chinese role and help, North Korea, I don't think they have joined this meeting because they were really concerned about the Kim Jong-un security, personal security, as a matter of fact. But China has provided a very important means of security guarantee for himself because it was a China Air that they aligned. So at least it can kind of a guarantee of the security for Mr. Kim. And while Mr. Kim was absent from his country, he was maybe looking forward to kind of potential help and assistance if there's something happens during his absence. So I think China made a very important commitment to his personal security during his two meetings, one in Beijing and one Dalian. I think that kind of commitment by the Chinese leadership was a very important assurance for Mr. Kim Jong-un to make final visit to the Singapore summit. So China definitely has been a very important role, and I think that's why China should be credited for the successful meeting out of Singapore this time. No question about that.
Right. They also supported Kim Jong-un with the itineraries, which was very complicated. None of the journalists actually found out until he landed in Singapore, right? So that definitely shows that they were helping him go through all the security.
That's right. I think this is a kind of covert military operation, by the way, because China and North Korea are very good at conducting this kind of covert operations, whether it be diplomatic or military and whatnot. They are very good, and they are communist country, and they are just living each other for long. They are good neighbors, and they find in each other growing importance for their own security. That's why China has been providing very good logistics, all kind of supports for this particular summits, but also they were going to play a more important role by providing security assurances to the Kim Jong-un himself and also to the regime, which cannot be necessarily provided by the United States. So I think this is a very complementary role played by the United States and China as well. But Singapore, also South Korea has played a very important role because President Moon Jae-in was the initiator of this kind of series of meetings between the leaders. Otherwise, unless we had the first meeting, inter-Korean summit meeting on Panmunjom, April 27th, I guess, this could not be possible. So this is a package of two series of meetings, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot of more additional summit meetings between all the regional powers in this part of the world regarding the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and also how we're going to establish a new peace regime on the peninsula, plus how we're going to provide some economic assistance to the North Korean leadership and to the North Korean country as a whole.
I see. So yes, as you said, we need multilateral efforts from each sides of the Asian and other countries, including the United States. After the Kim-Trump talks, a renewed focus is being placed on the role of China. Here's a short video explaining China's growing influence.
Beijing offered North Korean leader Kim Jong-un a special jet for his travel to Singapore to attend the North Korea-U.S. summit, in a sign of its continued influence over the communist regime. China welcomed the progress made in the historic meeting, saying the two sides were creating a new history. But it also sent a clear message about its involvement in the future process.
当然，我们也愿意看到有关对话都会做出积极努力。中国，我们会继续发挥我们的建设性的作用。
In a press conference after the summit, U.S. President Donald Trump talked about having South Korea and China involved in the signing of a peace treaty with Pyongyang. He also said the U.S. would suspend joint military exercises with South Korea as part of the denuclearization process, which is essentially the freeze-for-freeze proposal Beijing has been pushing for years. This has led to an observation that the biggest winner of the Kim-Trump summit is China. China has been wary of losing its influence over the Korean peninsula amid the rapid improvement in relations between North Korea and the United States. After the Singapore summit, China suggested sanctions relief for North Korea, citing that Pyongyang agreed to work toward denuclearization.
有关决议规定，需根据朝鲜遵守履行决议的情况，是需调整制裁措施。
However, President Trump made it clear that the sanctions will remain in force until full denuclearization. What role will Beijing play in the post-summit process towards Pyongyang's complete denuclearization? We connect with China's CGTN to discuss the country's relations to the summit and its future involvement.
And now to examine China's take on the Kim-Trump summit, we have Liu Xin on the line, a senior host of a primetime opinion show at China CGTN, a national English broadcaster. Hello, Xin.
Hi, Sang-mi.
So, Xin, what is the public sentiment in China and the government response to this outcome of the Singapore summit?
Well, for very obvious reasons, the Chinese people are very, very focused on this issue. I think just as much as your people over there, right? You are the immediate neighbor. So are we. I mean, especially people in the northeastern provinces, we're across the river from the DPRK. So any development on that part of the world will directly affect us. And also China has such a special relationship to the people of the DPRK and to the DPRK government. Let's not forget the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un visited China twice. Right, in a matter of a couple of weeks, and he gave his very first overseas trip to China. So a lot of attention, a lot of Chinese people were following it step by step, moment by moment, and analyzing all of the details, what was happening, the handshake, the smile, the body language, and all of that. So I think what came out was something, and the atmosphere was something that the Chinese people in general welcome very much. Smiles, handshakes. The agreement to sit down and talk is always better than mutual threats, than calling each other by their names and threatening to use force. Even if there are the lack of details, even if there are the possibility that things go wrong again in the future, I think for the moment we need to seize the momentum, and people appreciate that. Let's build on the momentum and make the best out of it. I think that is the general sentiment of the Chinese public.
I see, Xin. Before we move on to other questions, I actually wanted to ask about this report about Kim Jong-un, that he stopped over in Beijing on his way home after the summit. Do you have any information on that?
I don't think there's any confirmation on that. I don't think he stopped over. This is not what we heard. What the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, that China provided air service to the DPRK leader upon their request, but there is never any confirmation as whether he stopped over in Beijing.
I understand. Thank you. And before we ask other questions to Xin, Doctor, I want to ask you about this report of Chinese media that has been asking about who will pay for the denuclearization process of Pyongyang, especially when it comes to economic support of this country. So what do you think the Chinese government will think about this?
When it comes to denuclearization in North Korea first, a lot of countries will be involved, not just China, United States, South Korea, and Japan as well, and Russia as well, because we had a precedent already for these former Soviet republics back after the 1990-something, when North Korea and Soviet Union collapsed. We conducted very important CTR programs, which is called corporate threat reduction, as in Kazakhstan, Ukraine. So they spent, United States, of course, spent a lot of money, but South Korea and Japan also played a very important bill. They put a lot of large bill, and not just these two countries, but we have to give the technology and money and personnel to conduct this kind of denuclearization process. So it will definitely United States and South Korea and Japan will be involved in this process. And China also might be interested in joining this kind of process because this is very important and they have a lot of cultural affinity between the two countries and they also had to have a lot of personal exchange between the two countries. So China, unlike other countries, they can play a very important role even in denuclearizing the North Korean armed services and also the nuclear weapons and missiles. But also when it comes to providing some assistance, and China, of course, can provide important economic aid, but Japan is also ready to provide economic aid, and so is South Korea.
So on that, we want to hear a little more about Chinese government's idea. What do you think, Xin?
Well, there hasn't been any official rhetoric on who should be paying for this from the Chinese side. What China has been saying that we will continue to play a constructive role, but there's never mention of any money issue. I think China's position on this issue is pretty clear. China has always said the nuclear issue is not. It didn't happen because of China. It happened because of the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula, because of the conflict between the DPRK and the United States on the other side. So if you would follow this logic, I don't think it would be logical to expect China to be paying in part or wholly for this process and the United States not contributing to it. This is, of course, my personal opinion.
Right, Xin, as you mentioned earlier, of the welcoming public sentiment and the government's response to this outcome of the summit, the Chinese are also very positive about this event. And so do the Chinese government have any sort of roadmap that they want to engage in?
Well, I think China has a rough idea, right? I mean, we have already seen what has been happening has pretty much been in line with China has proposed. Basically, what China has proposed are two main ideas. One is the dual suspension, which means the DPRK suspends nuclear and missile tests on the one side, and on the side of the United States and the ROK, they would suspend their joint military exercises. I think this is only the start of a long process as confidence-building measures. And as we have seen coming out of the summit, this has actually become reality. So this is pretty much what China has been proposing all along. And then as to the long-term resolution of the situation of the crisis on the Korean Peninsula, China again suggested this dual track process, meaning we talk about the DPRK peace mechanism, and then we talk about, the Korean Peninsula peace mechanism, I should say, and the denuclearization. These are two sets of work which need to go parallel, but at the same time. And again, we are seeing signs that things are kind of following along these processes. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs again says facts have shown that what China have proposed are reasonable, are practical, and have been kind of adopted by the various sides. Another very important role China has been playing is, I think China wants to be the glue between all sides. I mean, China has a unique position as a longtime friend of the DPRK, right? We have these very special bonds. Some are calling this bond is even stronger, is even like a blood bond. People sacrificed, we fought next to each other. So we have this very special position to get close to the DPRK leadership, to talk to them from a position where no other parties concerned in this conflict have. And then I think another thing is also very important is what China has always been doing throughout the four-party talks or the six-party talks. China has been in contact with all of these major parties, with the United States, with ROK, with Russia, with Japan, and try to bring everybody to the negotiating table. I think China can continue to play a constructive role along all of these lines.
Right, Xin, you just mentioned dual suspension, which I assume is known for freeze. So can you tell us more about that? I remember that China suggested this proposal to President Trump last November, but it was flatly rejected by then. But now he went with that. President Trump went with that during the Singapore summit. So why do you think Trump suddenly changed his mind?
Well, I think, first of all, it's the idea itself is a reasonable one because it doesn't simply demand one party to do something and the other party not doing anything. When you try to resolve a long-standing dispute, both sides have to take the first step. And this first step must be symbolic, must be significant, and must be also kind of equal, that you can say, okay, I have done this and you have done equally as much, so we can go a bit further. As I said, this is a very important confidence-building measure. Basically, none of these two sides have lost anything for the moment, right? They simply suspended. At any time, these activity, if things don't go well, can be resumed. We hope not. But this is very much a symbolic gesture. I think first of all, this idea is a practical one. And secondly, I think the circumstances have changed. Last year, we all remember with this exchange of very bellicose rhetoric, sending military warships to the region and talking about firing missiles to each other. This is really getting everybody very, very nervous. And I think both the DPRK, especially the DPRK, sees the need that the situation has to turn around. So since the Pyeongchang Olympic Games, things took very dramatic turns. And now, as soon as you see the will, the wish, and the resolve from both sides to have a different path, I think the circumstances has made it possible that both sides adopt this dual suspension approach.
Thank you. That was Liu Xin from China's CGTN. So, Doctor, how do you parse into Xin's analysis?
One thing, if I might add to Liu Xin, is because all the previous government has taken, as a matter of fact, have taken the China style, the dual suspension as a matter of fact, even though under different names, the concepts are very similar, step by step, gradual, synchronized way. That have been the U.S. approach to the North Korean denuclearization issue in the past. But Mr. Trump believed this will not come about, bring any results. That's why he took a very different approach to this. So he made it very clear, but I think all the signs are coming from this particular meeting in Singapore that they finally failed to agree on this particular approach. So that's why they actually, it seems like they are leaning, following the model of the Chinese advice, because Chinese advice makes much more sense than more idealistic kind of one step, one package, one big deal type of operation. So that's why China played a very important role, and China gave a very important advice to the Pyongyang leadership that you should follow this kind of model because this will be more pragmatic and will provide all kind of security guarantee to you. So that's why, even though there is something a lot still left for the United States to actually work with all these concepts of CVIZ and CVID. But if you look at just a joint statement that just came out from the Singapore summit, was because it was very difficult that actually Mr. Pompeo tried to put this very important concept for the last 3 months, but actually they failed. But they don't want to admit that we failed. But instead they came up with a very better second alternative, which is, okay, CVIZ means it's a part of the complete denuclearization. We're going to work on those specific terms from this time on. So let's be satisfied with the the capital C in the first place. So that's why I think all came to the kind of more pragmatic and realistic appraiser, because they started with a very idealistic idea. Oh, we're going to have a very important, big deal, exchanging this and that. But when it comes to the meeting, and the North Koreans were very much resistant to taking that idea because they were not so sure about the security region guarantee they might be provided by the United States. So as Liu Xin aptly pointed out, with this kind of lack of trust in each other, that was maybe the most plausible, the best outcome for the two countries to agree on.
Okay, thank you, Doctor, for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure, as always.
This is where we wrap things up for now. We'll be back next week with another global issue that is hot off the press. Thank you for watching.